Whenever you see an Old West saloon in a TV show or a movie, they're always drinking, but they're never eating. But people did eat at Old West saloons. Not only did they eat, but often the lunch was free. And that free lunch could be anything from a sandwich to oysters to a big bowl of the classic Cowboy pork and beans. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, as we see what it was like to eat in an Old West saloon. This time, on Tasting History. Today I am in the old mining town, the old ghost town of Cerro Gordo, which sits in California right on the edge of Death Valley. Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was home to miners working the nearby silver, lead, and zinc mines. So naturally, the town had several saloons. Saloons that would feed and water the miners after they came down from chasing their fortune up in the hills. Now, whether you were in a big city like San Francisco or a tiny mining town like Cerro Gordo, when you stepped into a saloon you could count on getting a drink, and you could almost always count on getting some food too. What that food actually was, though, varied wildly. A lot of these places had fancy French cuisine prepared by actual French chefs, even out in small towns. But other saloons just had pickled eggs and pretzels. Basically the same kind of bar snacks you'd find today back in the 1930s. Writer George Ade wrote about the saloons he remembered from his youth. He said right in the middle of the stained tablecloth you'd find a bowl of baked beans next to it, a glass of cloudy, murky water with several forks sticking out of it, and you could tell those forks had been used over and over to scoop up beans. So I'm making the baked beans, but I'm skipping the shared glass of dirty utensil water because that is just gross. Now, I found tons of different baked bean recipes out there, but since saloons made this food to turn a profit, I figured I'd use a recipe from a book called Cooking for Profit. It was written specifically for restaurants and saloons of the Old West. First published in the San Francisco Hotel Gazette back in 1886, the recipe for baked pork and beans goes like this. Wash and sort through a large heaping cup of navy beans and soak them in water overnight. Put them on the stove the next morning with fresh water, enough to cover them well. Add a pinch of baking soda, about the size of a bean, and let them boil for about an hour. Then drain them in a colander. Put them back in the saucepan. Add cold water just up to the level of the beans. Bring it to a boil again, and in just a few minutes they'll be tender. Season with a little salt and a tablespoon of molasses. Divide them into 4 pint bowls or tin pans. Lay an ounce of salt pork on top of each and bake for half an hour. Super simple recipe. I actually found some even simpler ones that were literally just pork and beans, nothing else. No molasses, not even salt. Then I found some really elaborate ones with cayenne, onion, and all kinds of extra seasonings. So feel free to add more seasoning if you want, but I'm sticking to the original recipe. I'm using 1 1/4 cups of navy beans, 4 ounces of salt pork, scored and cut into 4 slices, a pinch of baking soda, a teaspoon of salt, and 1 tablespoon of molasses. First step, cover the beans with water and let them sit overnight. This is also a good time to rinse your salt pork if you're using it. Salt pork can be hard to find these days, so you can also use bacon, which doesn't need rinsing. But if you do use salt pork, you'll want to rinse it a couple times. Soak it in water for about an hour. Dump the water, add fresh water, soak it again, because it is extremely salty. Once the beans are done soaking, there shouldn't be much water left. They should have soaked most of it up. If there is any extra water, pour it off. Otherwise, dump the beans into a pot, sprinkle in the baking soda, add fresh water, just enough to cover the beans, plus about half an inch. Now here's where I'm making a small adjustment. Every other pork and beans recipe I found adds the pork right at this stage, but this one doesn't add it until the baking step. The problem with that is the pork won't be cooked through, and it definitely needs to be cooked. So I'm guessing the author just left that step out, or assumed the pork was cooked separately somewhere else, like on a skillet. I'm going to go ahead and add mine now. It will also add a lot more flavor to the beans as they cook. So add the pork to the beans, bring the pot up to a boil, Put the lid on and let the beans simmer for 1 full hour. Every now and then, lift the lid and skim off any foam that rises to the top, but mostly just leave it alone for an hour. After that hour, drain all the water off the beans, then add cold water, just even with the top of the beans. Bring it back to a boil and cook until the beans are nice and tender. This should take about 10 minutes. Then fish out the pork, add the salt and molasses, stir everything together to coat the beans evenly. Now, the original recipe has you divide this into 4 separate dishes, since it was made for restaurant service, served to individual customers. But in a saloon, this would have just been one big pot on the free lunch table. So I'm putting mine all into one large tin dish. Once the beans are in the dish, lay the pork slices on top. Put the whole thing in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 175 Celsius, for half an hour. Now, saloons in the Old West, especially in small towns like Cerro Gordo, were so much more than just a place to get a drink. They were often the very first building to go up in a new town. A saloon might double as a courtroom, a barber shop, the town hall, an undertaker's parlor, or even a church, if a traveling pastor happened to pass through. But day to day, its main job was food and drink. So other than baked beans, what else could you expect to find when you walked into an Old West saloon? Well, the exact definition of a saloon is a little hard to pin down. One definition is any place that serves both food and drink, but makes most of its money from drinks. Historically, that definition doesn't always fit, but it works for what we're talking about today. As towns popped up across the American West, the saloon was almost always the first permanent building. At first, it was usually nothing more than a tent with a few tables and chairs, just a place to wet your whistle. It was only after the town started to grow that they built a proper wooden building with wooden floors, a polished bar, and, of course, bat-wing doors. And yes, those swinging saloon doors were real. It wasn't just a movie trope, at least not after the 1870s. Once the special hinge was invented, a lot of saloons had those bat-wing doors. They were called that because they looked like bat wings. But behind those swinging doors, there were usually regular solid doors too, that you could close when it got cold. Or for whatever other reason, one reason for the bat-wing doors was ventilation, to let all the cigarette and cigar smoke out, and let fresh, cool air in, create a little cross breeze if you opened a window. But they were also mounted at just the right height so kids walking by couldn't peek inside and see all the drinking and gambling going on. And there was always plenty of drinking and gambling going on. As for gambling, the most popular games were poker and faro. Faro isn't really played much these days, but in the 19th century it was often more popular than poker. More people could play at once. The odds were better than most games of chance, and the rules were simple and easy to follow, which is always a plus when you've been drinking heavily. And a lot of people were drinking heavily, at least at any decent-sized saloon. So what exactly were they drinking? Well, one of the most popular spirits was whiskey. And there were usually 2 grades available, the good stuff and the not-so-good stuff. The good stuff was usually bottled back east, or imported from other countries, things like Old Forester bourbon or Dewar's Scotch. It usually came in a labeled bottle. The not-so-great stuff was usually made and bottled right out back, and it usually didn't have an official name, but people gave it very colorful names, things like coffin varnish, cactus juice, sheep dip, tarantula juice, firewater, rotgut, and plenty of other vivid nicknames. These were usually locally distilled, neutral grain spirits flavored with coffee, chilies, or tobacco, and spiked with things like strychnine, turpentine, or sulfuric acid to give it some extra bite. Basically, if you cared about taste, you bought the good stuff and paid accordingly. But if you just cared about the effect, you went for the rotgut. You'd get the same results, if not stronger, for half the price. If neither of those sounded good, most saloons also served beer and champagne. Yes, champagne. Champagne was actually way more common in the Old West than most people realize today. Even here in Cerro Gordo, they found tons of champagne bottles from the era. One reason for that was that you could water down whiskey or beer or pretty much anything else. But when you heard a champagne bottle pop, you knew exactly what it was. One thing I find really interesting about whiskey and other spirits back then is that today, the bartender pours your drink for you. You're at their mercy for how much you get. But back in the Old West, that wasn't always how it worked. It was customary to belly up to the bar, name your drink it fast, and make room for the next person. The bartender didn't pour the liquor into glasses for you if you ordered scotch or whatever you wanted. He'd grab the bottle in his right hand, a glass in his left, cross his arms and set both down in front of you. You took as big or as small a drink as you wanted, all for 10 cents. The price was the same no matter how much you drank, though I imagine it really depended on who was behind the bar. A lot of bartenders, especially if they owned the place, had a reputation for being pretty stingy. One writer looking back on his saloon days said, "The thing that stands out most in my memory is how hard, cold, and unfeeling most saloon keepers were. All that good fellowship and camaraderie that some people imagine in old saloons was pretty much missing when it came to the owners. I never knew a saloon keeper who was a real good fellow." Though according to Mark Twain, the cheapest and easiest way to become an influential man and be looked up to by the whole community was to stand behind a bar, wear a big diamond pin, and sell whiskey. Now, there were bartenders, often called mixologists back then, who were well loved by their communities and were real bon vivants, and those bartenders usually made cocktails. Not every saloon served cocktails, but cocktails were a lot more popular in the Old West than you might think. They were usually made with whiskey, gin, or brandy with names like cobblers, smashes, juleps, flips, and crustas. They usually weren't as complicated as modern cocktails, but they were a great way to make bad liquor taste better. They were also seen as a sort of tonic, since they very often included bitters, which were considered medicinal, and supposedly they were good for what ailed you, though you might want to read the room before ordering a cocktail if you were in a place like Seattle or San Francisco. Back then, ordering a cocktail was totally fine, but if you were in a tiny town like Cerro Gordo and you ordered a hot gin fizz or a warm toddy, people might say you had an educated thirst, and that was not a compliment. Better to just stick to straight whiskey. Now, just as different saloons served different drinks, they also served very different food, just like bars and restaurants today. They ran the full spectrum. There were tiny one-room saloons with a handful of tables, a few spittoons, sawdust on the floors, and a rickety piano in the corner. And then there were grand multi-story buildings decked out with velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, silver-framed mirrors behind the bar, and can-can dancers performing every night, for example, at the Occidental Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona. Their Sunday dinner menu included things like chicken giblet soup, salmon, leg of lamb with oysters, an assortment of cold meats, boiled meats, and roasts like suckling pig or pork with applesauce. Fancy dishes like cream fricassee of chicken and lapin domestique, with desserts of custard, fruit pies, and plum pudding. French cuisine was all the rage in America at the time, and that included the Old West. Even way out near Death Valley there was a French restaurant. There in the 1800s, which is just wild. There isn't even a French restaurant there now. But for every one of those fancy, high-end saloons, there were probably half a dozen more modest ones. They served merchants' lunches that usually cost 10 or 15 cents and came with a beer plus a little stew, or baked beans, or roast beef with mashed potatoes and gravy. And then there was the free lunch, a staple of saloon culture all across the country in the late 19th century. It wasn't actually free, of course. The idea was simple. You walked into the saloon, you bought one drink, and for the price of that drink you got full access to the lunch table. Usually the food you could eat was worth way more than the price of that one drink, so it was up to the bartender to make sure you kept drinking so they could make their money back. One writer of the time noted the cheapest places for a man to eat are these so-called free lunches, though that's probably a mistake, because these free lunches are attached to bars, and guests are expected to buy enough drinks to pay for all the free food they get. San Francisco saloons were especially famous for their free lunches in 1891. Rudyard Kipling, author of The Jungle Book, passed through San Francisco and visited a saloon where he saw men with their hats pushed back on their heads, wolfing down food from a counter. He wrote about the institution of the free lunch. You paid for one drink and got as much food as you could eat for less than ₹1 a day. A man could feed himself very well in San Francisco, even if he was completely broke. Remember that if you ever find yourself stranded out there. And just because it was free doesn't mean it was bad food. One account described a free spread that included a huge silver tureen of excellent oyster soup, a whole round of beef that must have weighed at least 40 pounds, dishes full of potatoes, stewed mutton, stewed tomatoes, and macaroni Alfredo. All of that for the cost of a 15-cent drink, which, adjusted for inflation, would be about $4.25 today. Basically, all you can eat, plus a drink. The thing is, especially in big cities, with lots of competition, saloons kept making the food better and more plentiful to outdo each other, and eventually, it got to the point where nobody could drink enough to make up for the cost of the food, so all the saloons started losing money on it. As far back as November of 1854, the saloon owners of San Francisco got together to try to put an end to free lunches. But after 2 meetings, they realized that if even just a few saloons held out and kept offering free lunch, they'd steal all the customers. So free lunches stuck around for all the freeloaders out there, and there were definitely freeloaders. It was not uncommon for people to just walk into a saloon, walk straight up to the lunch table and start eating. And if no one called them over to buy a drink, they'd eat as much as they could, then try to slip out unnoticed while the bartender was busy. Of course, in smaller towns like Cerro Gordo, the free lunch usually wasn't quite so fancy. Partly because there wasn't as much competition from other saloons, it also usually depended on who ran the place and who was doing the cooking in the back, for example. There were lots of Chinese-owned saloons that served chop suey and chow mein, super popular in the Old West. Lots of German saloons served different sausages like bratwurst with sauerkraut on the side. And then, of course, there were lots of Mexican saloons, since California and most of the Southwest was part of Mexico until 1848. They served things like pozole and tamales on the menu. Almost all free lunches had a spread of things like cheeses, pickles, cold cuts, clams, and oysters. Oysters were incredibly popular all across America back then, but especially out in the Old West among cowboys and miners. You don't usually see people eating oysters in old Western movies, but they ate them all the time. Sometimes they were fresh oysters, shipped in on trains from places like San Francisco, but a lot of the time, especially in small towns far from the rail line, they were canned oysters. Then there was another category of food that you could almost always count on at a free lunch. Things like pretzels, crackers, bits of cheese and sausage, and a salt pickle or a radish. These were foods meant to make you thirsty, not fill you up. Salty snacks are still common at bars today for exactly that reason. Pretzels and salted peanuts are still everywhere. But one snack that didn't survive to modern times was the sardelle, a tiny, silvery little minnow related to the sardine, packed in brine and sold by the barrel. It became one of the staple snacks at every saloon that did a steady beer business. They were saltier than the ocean and served whole. They were hugely popular because after a patron ate a couple of them, laid across a slice of rye bread, they'd have to rush back to the bar and drink a lot of beer to wash the taste out. Those sardelles were more than just fish. They were silent business partners. Now that we know what they drank and what they ate at an Old West saloon, I have to wonder, how did they eat it? What did it look like? These were communities where men outnumbered women 20 to 1, 30 to 1, even 40 to 1. so I'm guessing table manners weren't exactly a top priority. And luckily for us, there was a rather prim Englishman who visited a saloon in Ogden, Utah in the 1880s and wrote all about it. He said, "I saw a sight that filled me with astonishment and dismay. It was a man eating his dinner, and let me say with all possible courtesy that the American traveler is the most shocking eater I have ever seen. He never seems to chew his food, but dabs and pecks at dish after dish so quickly it's like a juggling act you'd pay to see in London. Every now and then he closes his eyes and strains his throat, which I assume is when he swallows. I've seen children eat cake with the same sort of convulsive motion." The best part is he then lists everything the man ate. He writes, "The strange mixture of food does not bother me. If a man wants to eat mouthfuls of huckleberries, bacon, apple pie, pickled mackerel, peas, mutton, gherkins, oysters, radishes, tomatoes, custard, and poached eggs all mixed up together, that's none of my business." "This is an actual meal I wrote down in my notebook, right there in total disorder," he says. The whole meal lasted barely 5 minutes. Then the man grabbed a handful of toothpicks and leaned lazily against the doorpost like he had all the time in the world. The whole thing is a complete mystery to me, so to honor the rugged pioneers of the American West, I think I should drop all proper manners as I dig into my pork and beans, which should be just about done. And here we have it, baked pork and beans, straight from an Old West saloon. Bon appétit. I love baked beans. These are really good. I will say they could be a little softer. They're not too firm or anything. I just personally prefer a softer bean, but the flavor is outstanding. It's actually so much better than what you get out of a can, even though there's barely anything in it. No onion, no spices, nothing, just that molasses. And the that salt pork really adds so much depth. I'm not usually big on eating the pork straight from pork and beans because it's usually super fatty, and this is no exception, but I'll take a bite just to see. It's really fatty. It's really good though. Yeah, these are great. I'm definitely going to be finishing these tonight.